I just arrive up and everybody quiets down. That's so interesting. Well, I'm Jeremy Baskus from the History Department, and I welcome you to the inaugural lecture in this new series titled the Robert Kragalott Lecture on Genocide, Mass Atrocity, and Human Rights. It's in honor of Dr. Robert Kragalott, who was a professor of history here at Ohio Wesleyan from 1964 to 1991. I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Pete Kegel. Pete Kegel, who is the class of 1969 Ohio Wesleyan, and whose vision was all important in the creation of this lecture series. He made a very generous gift to endow this lectureship and has made this exciting evening and the many future years of exciting evenings possible. Pete graduated from Ohio Wesleyan in 1969 with a history major, and obviously a great interest in European history, which was cultivated by studying under Dr. Kragalott. After leaving Ohio Wesleyan, Dr. Kegel went to Brown University and studied history for a while before entering into a career of business for much of his career, but later in his career he returned to his great passion, which is, of course, history. He received a master's degree in Holocaust studies and then the PhD in modern European history, from the University of London. Pete subsequently converted his dissertation into a book titled The American West and the Nazi East, a comparative and interpretive perspective, which was published in 2011 by Palgrave Press. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kegel, who will share a few words of introduction for us.
Thanks, Jeremy, for that very generous introduction. I'm particularly pleased that you mentioned the book, which will be coming out in paperback soon. Ohio Wesleyan students, past and present, all agree the university's most important asset has always been and remains today the faculty. Outstanding teaching has been a long hallmark of Ohio Wesleyan, a university which rightly prides itself on the quality and accessibility of the faculty. Exceptional professors have lifelong and enduring influences on their students. In some cases, these influences are immediate and instantly recognizable. In other cases, they are longer term and take longer to realize. It's my privilege this evening to offer up some brief remarks about the man for whom this lecture series is named. Professor Robert Kragalott, inspiring teacher, valued mentor, and friend. I hope you will take time later to read the beautiful eulogy to Professor Kragalott, written by his colleague, Professor Richard Spall, which truly captures both the professional and personal sides of Dr. Kragalott, and you can find that on the History Department website. As Professor Spall notes, there is today an army of loyal alumni who attribute much of their academic growth and career success to what happened in Dr. Kragalott's classroom, at his seminar table, and across from his desk. As a student of Dr. Kragalott from 1965 to 1969, I, like hundreds of other Kragalott students, benefited greatly from the Kragalott experience as both a student of history and as a global citizen. As someone who had lived and studied abroad, Dr. Kragalott had a global perspective, and he emphasized the importance of developing an empathetic understanding of other peoples, cultures, and histories. As others in my generational cohort are well aware, the 1960s was a tumultuous, turbulent, and chaotic time to be a college student. The Vietnam War, the Cold War, the student movement, and the civil rights movement were all swirling around us. As someone with a global perspective, Dr. Kragalott urged his students to be conscious of and involved in national and world events, especially as they impacted other people around the nation and around the world. He challenged us to rethink our accepted, comfortable, and inherited ideas and worldviews, and to learn about and respect the histories, cultures, and viewpoints of others around the globe. Professor Kragalott inspired in me a love for history and historical inquiry, a passion, or as my wife would likely say, an obsession, which has remained with me for more than 4 decades. As a teacher, Dr. Kragalott always set the bar high. His courses were not for the faint-hearted, nor for anyone allergic to a lot of reading and writing. He attracted students looking for a challenge. Dr. Kragalott was firmly committed to the Ohio Wesleyan model of teaching and learning, a model that extends beyond formal classroom instruction. Whether it was in the classroom, in his office, or over lunch in Delaware, I knew that I could always count on him for stimulating conversation, considered advice, and a sincere dedication to my academic progress. Dr. Kragalott loved teaching history. He was always recruiting history majors for the department, and he was constantly promoting the classes offered by his other history department colleagues. Committed to valued-centered education, he was a co-founder in 1967 of the Ohio Wesleyan Forum, a forerunner of today's Sagan National Colloquium. He organized the first Forum course, a course on 20th century revolutionary movements around the world, my favorite undergraduate course at Ohio Wesleyan. Course participants had to attend a minimum of 10 lectures during the term, do assigned readings, and take a 3-hour final, all for 1/4 of a credit. Over 300 students took that course, and we were treated to incredible lectures by world-class scholars on revolutionary movements from Russia to Cuba, from Egypt to Vietnam. To be sure, Dr. Kragalott exemplified the student-mentor relationship, a relationship which lies at the foundation and heart of the Ohio Wesleyan experience. From my frequent visits to campus, I know that the student-mentor relationship is alive and well at Ohio Wesleyan today. And so to today's Ohio Wesleyan student, and I'm so pleased that there are so many students here, I encourage you to take full advantage of your time and opportunities here at Ohio Wesleyan. I encourage you to seek out the most challenging courses, to find your Dr. Kragalott, and to make your educational odyssey truly a lifelong journey. In closing, let me reiterate my sincere hope that the Kragalott lectures will encourage the Ohio Wesleyan community and our guests to engage with past and sadly recurring global instances of genocide, mass atrocity, and human rights denial. It is also my sincere hope that your new or increased awareness of these important global issues will inspire you to join with the thousands of activists around the world committed to preventing or stopping genocide and other forms of mass violence against non-combatants, and to ensuring basic human rights for all the world's peoples. So thanks again for coming out tonight, helping us honor Dr. Kragalott. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you again, Pete, for your wonderful generosity in sponsoring this endowment, endowing this endowment, and for your nice words of introduction. Before I introduce the main speaker of the night, I want to recognize Kathy Frisora, who's our administrative assistant in the history department, who really did everything to bring the talk together. So. It's now my pleasure to introduce the main event, Dr. Timothy Snyder, Professor of History at Yale University. Dr. Snyder, who is a native of Ohio, received his doctorate in history at Oxford University in England. in 1997. In the 15 years since then, he's been very busy. He's written 5 books, soon to be 6, I understand, which explore a wide variety of issues in modern history of Eastern Europe particularly. In his free time, he has co-edited 2 books and published more than a dozen scholarly articles. His 5th book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, has been especially widely touted and has received a number of prestigious awards. It's available in more than 20 languages, but I really recommend that you read it in its original English. Dr. Snyder's talk today is titled Global Holocaust, the Central European Past and Our Future. Please welcome Yale University Professor Timothy Snyder.
So it's a very great honor to have been asked to deliver this lecture in particular, this first lecture in this endowed series. My great thanks to Ohio Wesleyan, to Jeremy for the organization, and to Pete for the thought. It's really a beautiful tribute to a teacher, and the notion for a teacher that one could be remembered, let's say a few years down the line, and honored is an extraordinary thing. And I will try to do justice to this legacy of teaching in this lecture. Since this is a series on genocide, atrocity, and human rights, what I would like to do this evening is try to give you an explanation for what is the foundational event in this sad history, to try to give you an explanation of the mass murder of Europe's Jews in the middle of the 20th century. The Holocaust in the title is the Holocaust of the European Jews between 1941 and 1945. What I intend to do is to try to explain this event in a global way. And by global, I mean general, and by global, I also mean in a way that takes into account how the people at the time, above all Adolf Hitler, thought about the globe and thought about world history. If we think about this event globally, I believe, we see, unfortunately, resemblances to the present day. We see common threads that continue to run into the 21st century. And so if I have time, and you're still here, I'm going to say a few words at the very end about what an understanding of the Jewish Holocaust of the 1940s might mean for the decades to come. Now, the problem with trying to explain the Holocaust is this. There is a text, Mein Kampf, the book that Hitler wrote in prison. This text, Mein Kampf, in a way tells you everything you need to know about the Holocaust. I'm going to be explaining the worldview contained in this book. But the problem here is that many people write books that contain their preposterous worldviews, right? You probably know some people who have written books that contain their preposterous worldviews. Some of them are probably in your syllabi. There are many books that contain the preposterous worldviews of people written in prison or otherwise, that contain the preposterous worldviews of failed artists, the preposterous worldviews of battle-scarred soldiers, which Hitler also was. The problem is that most of these preposterous worldviews are not actually realized. Right? Most of these texts are bound for the wastebasket. Most of these texts will never have significance. But this text actually described the world as it was to be. This text that Hitler wrote in the 1920s described the world that he was able to make by the 1940s, a world which in many ways is still with us. So we have a problem here. And the problem is how to account for that. How do we account for the realization of this worldview? So to try to explain this, I'm going to first pause a bit on what I take this worldview to be, which is not so simple. And then I'm going to try to explain how this worldview might actually have been implemented, might have been brought to life. So Hitler was, in a very sad and tragic way, a kind of global thinker. Hitler's thinking about the world begins at what I would call an ecological level. Hitler's thinking about the Jews, about the Germans, about the various peoples of the world whom he regarded as races, begins with an understanding of the planet in ecological terms. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that Hitler, in Mein Kampf and elsewhere, presents a picture of the planet which is clear, which is easy to understand, and which is desperately violent in its implications. The way that Hitler presents the planet is this. The planet Earth is covered by a certain amount of territory. Of that territory, a certain amount can be farmed. The only thing that truly matters in the world is the competition of races for that limited amount of farmland. The only good in the world is that struggle. There is no good beyond that. The only good is what Hitler takes to be the natural struggle of what he regards to be races for control of territory, for control of food. Hitler makes a very important point for his own worldview, which is there is no scientific solution to this. He considers briefly and then discards something that those of you who are from the Midwest should probably know about, I'm sure do know about, and that is the possibility that science might actually make the earth more fertile than it was. Right? He considers that possibility and discards it. Science will not change the world. The only thing that can change the world, and here's where things start to become truly dark, the only thing that can change the world will be the removal of the factor which prevents this natural bloody competition from continuing. What is this factor? This factor in Hitler's views, the thing which corrupts the planet, the thing which has ruined the natural order, the thing which has destroyed the only harmony which is possible, the harmony of bloody struggle, this thing is the existence of the Jews. Now, it's important to be clear about just how fundamental a role the Jews play in Hitler's view of the planet. We sometimes say that Hitler regarded the Jews as Untermenschen, that they were subhumans, or that Hitler regarded the Jews as threatening others. These descriptions do not begin to capture the significance of Jews in the worldview. The problem with the Jews is that they are not like another species. If the Jews were just a species, if they were just a race, you could compete with them, you could fight a war with them, you could take their territory, maybe they would take yours, that would be fine too. The only important thing is the struggle. But the Jews are not a species, they're not a race. They're a factor that corrupts the rules of nature. Their corrupting character consists in this. They don't recognize what Hitler regards as the only rule, the only law of nature, and that is struggle. What Jews do is they try to corrupt the beautiful harmony of bloody struggle by introducing concepts, thoughts, introducing ways of seeing the world that prevent us from understanding that our only destiny is racial war. What are these concepts? These are things that will be familiar to you. These concepts, says Hitler. Remember, all of this is Hitler, right? I'm going to be talking in Hitler's voice for a long time, and I want you to imagine those giant quotation marks, right? What Hitler says is that the Jews have introduced concepts, universal concepts, which allow people from different races to identify with each other, which is terrible. What are these concepts? They are things like the state, so the notion of the state as a neutral political order in which we are citizens, right, rather than members of ethnicities or races. Law, the idea of the rule of law, that we are all subordinate to a single moral giving authority. Capitalism, the free market, also a Jewish invention. Economic liberalism, the notion that there ought to be free markets, Jewish. And, interestingly enough, communism, also a Jewish invention, which has the problem that it creates false solidarity, as Hitler sees things, among the working classes of the world, right? A German worker and an American worker and a Paraguayan worker are all members of the working class, says a socialist or a communist. So these false ideas, says Hitler, are what prevent us from being ourselves. What we are members of races who should be struggling for the good of the race. These notions, falsely introduced by this deeply corrupting factor into our world, into our minds, are what Hitler sees as the Jewish problem. Now, there's a historical example of this, of how this happened for Hitler, and that historical example is the First World War. The First World War, which Germany of course lost, is the inexplicable failure that Hitler has to assign to the Jews. It's the example of all of this in his mind. It's the war where he fought. It's the war where his comrades fell. It's the war where Germany lost 2.5 million men, and then inexplicably, as Hitler sees it, lost. And that is just one example of how Jews corrupt things, because the reason that Hitler thinks the Germans lost the war has to do with Jews and socialists and the law and the state and all of these sorts of things. Now, what are the implications of this worldview, of this ecological worldview, this planetary worldview? There are three very important ones. The first is Germans are always victims. Always victims. So long as there are Jews in the world breaking the rules, so to speak, the Germans are victims, because the Germans are being prevented from carrying out the natural struggle which would allow them to realize their destiny on the planet. So long as Jews exist, Germans are victims. Even if Germans might kill Jews, so long as there are any Jews left, the Germans will always be victims. Second implication, destroying the goods, destroying the Jews would be a good in and of itself. Right? So it's not just that if the Germans destroy the Jews, that would be good for Germany. Because remember, the Jews aren't like another racial enemy. There's something beyond that. They're a metaphysical force. There's something which they transform the rules of nature, thinks Hitler. So if the Germans destroy the Jews, it's not that they'll be doing good for Germans, it's that they will be saving the world. They will be saving the world. Even if Germans destroyed themselves trying to destroy the Jews, they would be saving the world. Now, I'm stressing these points because I need you to understand, or I'd very much, need is a strong word, I would very much like for you to understand that these sentiments about Jews go beyond what we might think of when we think of anti-Semitism. They go beyond what we think of even when we think of racism. The Jews are regarded certainly not as individuals, not even as a race, but the thing that is destroying the whole planet. So that's the first level of this worldview, the planetary level. There's a second level of this worldview, which is slightly more down to earth, and that is the global level. So this ecological level, this planetary level, is thought of on the example of species, on an analogy to species. But Hitler understands that the world isn't really as simple as that. And at other points, he writes about the globe. And the difference between the planet and the globe that I have in mind here is the planet is a planet of species, it's biological. The globe is a terrain of powers, of great powers, of political powers, of states. And Hitler understands that what's happening in the world is not that you and I are actually hungry and scratching the ground for food. He understands that's not really literally the case. He understands that globally what's going on is that powers, great powers, empires, are competing to control territory where food can be grown. That this is geopolitics. The flaw here, Hitler says, is that what appears to be the free market, the global free market, is not actually free. It appears to be a competition, but it's not really the competition that he has in mind. It's corrupt. It's corrupt because Jews who are in charge of capitalism, remember, right? Jews who are in charge of capitalism are also in charge of places like Wall Street, places like Fleet Street, and they're capable of doing terrible things which ruin the free market. Again, his main example comes from the First World War. During the First World War, Germany was blockaded, which was extraordinarily serious because Germany is not self-sufficient in food. So Germans actually did go hungry during the First World War in a way which was unthinkable for Americans. And the British continued the blockade until the Germans signed the peace treaty. So 6 months after the war was over, the Germans were still being blockaded. So Hitler thinks of the blockade as an example of how this free market is not really free. This thing called capitalism is not really a neutral order. It's just one of the facades for the global power of the Jews. So what follows from this is that if Germany is to break free from Jewish power, from this power to blockade Germany, Germany must conquer a huge amount of territory. It must become a huge land empire, a frontier empire. It must expand to such an extent that it is self-sufficient in food, that it can supply its people with food forever. Now remember, Hitler doesn't think there are scientific solutions for this, right? If you and I wanted more food, we would use more, appropriately correct pesticides, irrigation, Great hybrids are always better. Hitler, remember, excludes science. This is an important part of his worldview. Science is not going to save us. And by the way, this is significant because the thing about science is that science can save us all, whereas technology is always unevenly distributed around the world. So if you get rid of science and if you don't believe in science, but you do believe in technology, which might seem like a strange thing to say, but it describes about 3/4 of the American population. If you don't believe in science, but you do believe in technology, right, then you don't believe there's going to be a general solution for everyone, but you do believe that your tanks work, right, for example. And that is the relevant example. What Hitler thinks is that the Germans are going to be able to conquer a huge amount of territory in Eastern Europe precisely, which will make them self-sufficient. So now the interesting thing about this is that Hitler also knows that it's not just about the conquest of enough food. When Hitler thinks globally, as he does in Mein Kampf, he's aware that it's not just a matter of breaking British power, which he thinks is Jewish power, so that the Germans can have enough food. He knows that food is about more than just survival. He knows that food is also about comfort. He knows that food is about being satisfied, about being happy. So this space in the East that the Germans have to conquer for themselves to survive is called Lebensraum. You might have heard that term. And Lebensraum brings to mind this brutal struggle of destroying others so you can control territory. But Lebensraum in German actually has a second meaning. One meaning of Lebensraum is, oh yes, that Eastern Empire which we failed to get. But the other meaning of Lebensraum is actually just your living space, literally your living room, the nice place where you might sit and have a meal. And for Hitler, the word actually has both of these meanings. He means by Lebensraum controlling enough territory, not just so that we can survive, but so that we can be like Americans. Okay? Hitler's global view includes Americans. He looks out in the 1920s and says, who is prosperous, who has enough food, who is happy, who is going to dominate the globe in the next century? Americans. And more than that, he knows that not only he is doing it, he believes, and correctly, that German housewives, he has a bit of an obsession with German housewives, that German housewives are looking around the world and they recognize that the American standard of living is higher and improving all the time, and that they want their households to be just as prosperous as American households. So Lebensraum means, on the one hand, this terrible, brutal struggle for control, but on the other hand, it means making sure that German housewives are satisfied with the standard of living of their families, that we cannot fall behind America in this. So the global view includes getting out of the British stranglehold, but it also includes catching up with the Americans. Now, since this is the globe, there's also a third power involved, right? I mentioned the British, the Americans. What is the other great power in the world at this time? The other emerging great power in this time is the Soviet Union. Now, where is this territory going to come from? You know, try to think of a map of Europe. If you look from Germany eastward, where is this territory going to come from? In Hitler's mind, it's going to come from the Soviet Union. Germany is going to destroy the Soviet Union. In particular, Germany must control the fertile soil of Ukraine in order to become autarkic, in order to have a magical economy capable of transformation, in order to satisfy all these German housewives. Germany must control Ukraine. Now that might sound very strange, right? Because at the moment, no one is really trying to control Ukraine, because at the moment the resource that we obsess about is oil or gas. So if you think of food as a natural resource, if you think of food that was something which was scarce, which it was, hard to produce, then if you can just imagine that Ukraine was a bit like Saudi Arabia, you know, only more so. From the point of view of a world in which food was still scarce, controlling territory really did matter. So the notion is that if we control the fertile soil of Ukraine, then we become this self-sufficient empire. Then we become our Lebensraum. How is this going to be possible? Destroying the Soviet Union doesn't seem like such an easy thing to do, right? But to Hitler, there's a solution. From Hitler's point of view of the globe, it's not just that capitalism isn't what it says it is. Now, what capitalism says it is a free struggle, but it's not. It's actually a Jewish plot. Communism is also not what it says it is. Communism is not an effort to bring justice to the workers of the world. Communism is an attempt by Jews to control the workers of the world, right? And so the Soviet Union, according to this reasoning, is not a worker state, it's a Jewish state. And if it's a Jewish state, how do you destroy it? Well, the formula is very simple, and Hitler spells it out quite simply. If it's a Jewish state, then all you have to do are destroy the Jews. Hitler's historical view of Eastern Europe is this. The East Europeans, the Slavs, have never been able to create states on their own. For their entire history, the Germans came in and organized them. And now there's this brief interval between 1917 and the 1920s where the Jews are doing it. So all we have to do, we Germans, is go in, destroy those Jews, and assert our natural control over these territories. And it's over. So what are the implications of this? Well, one of them is that the Germans have to colonize Eastern Europe. On what model? On the American model. All of this hangs together in Hitler's mind. On the American model. Why is America so proud and self-sufficient? Well, because America, in Hitler's view, is an essentially Germanic state settled by Germans and Swedes and Scandinavians who very cleverly, you see how this holds together, right? Who very cleverly exploited exterminatory policies against the native populations and enslaved huge numbers of people in order to conquer a frontier empire. So just as the Americans moved west, says Hitler, the Germans are going to move east. So it's all, you see, it's a global thought. Now there are elements of it that are preposterous. There are elements of it that touch reality. As a whole, it's very coherent, and that's the problem, that it's coherent. The problem with ideologies is that they are coherent. They're stories that can bring you in, and this is a story that brought more and more people in. Now, the third level of Hitler's thinking, and this is the level people talk about the most, but it's actually the weakest and the least coherent. The third level of Hitler's ideological thinking is the German level, what we're actually going to do in Germany. Now, the reason why the thinking is weakest here is that there is a contradiction inside Hitler's thought. Hitler is basically a zoological anarchist. He's a zoological anarchist. He believes that the world, in fact, involves no authority but just a competition among races for control, right? Now, if that's your belief, how do you, and you believe that that natural state of things has been somehow corrupted, how can you get rid of the corruption? Well, the only way you can do it is by controlling a state. But if you're a zoological anarchist, you don't really believe in states, right? You believe that the world is a natural competition and so on and so forth. So this is the incoherence in Hitler's thought. In the beginning, he never thinks about the state. The state doesn't figure. The state, remember, is a kind of Jewish plot, right? The state doesn't figure in his thinking. So when he tries to seize power in 1923 by organizing a putsch, it's not very well planned. He just thinks everyone will rally around him, and he fails. So the practical conclusion he comes to when he's in prison, when he's writing Mein Kampf, is that he must conceal all of these radical aims. So all these things that I've talked about to you, all these things that are very explicit in Mein Kampf and Hitler's other writings, the planetary and the global anti-Semitism, he has to conceal those things. He has to either not mention them or speak about them in a very different way as he tries to come to power legally. Now, to make a long story short, this is the subject of another lecture, Hitler does come to power legally. The Great Depression comes, the National Socialist Party becomes very popular, they win elections, coalitions can't be made against them, the Chancellor names Hitler Prime Minister. He does come to power. And from there, 1933 is when that happens, forward, there's a kind of natural story in the historiography, in history books about how the Holocaust happens. But Hitler's problem is also the historian's problem. Hitler hasn't thought about the state, really. And historians haven't thought about the state either. Historians are just putting this entire story inside Germany. So in a way, once Hitler takes power in Germany, it's all over. But that doesn't actually make any sense. And let me try to tell you why. The Jews of Europe are not in Germany. If you look at the Holocaust from the end, 97% of the Jews who were killed are not German citizens. So the story of how they are killed cannot happen inside Germany. For that matter, most of the people who kill Jews are also not Germans. They haven't experienced Hitler's rule themselves. And so something must be going on that transcends Germany. What I would propose to do in the second part of this lecture is to try to think seriously about the state. Why? First of all, because we need an explanation for what happens, and I think this weak point of Hitler's thought, the state, is where we might start. And the second reason is that in order to have a history of the Holocaust, we have to have the Jews. It's strange, but in histories of the Holocaust, Jews only figure when and after they've been killed, which in some sense diminishes the significance of what's going on. In histories of the Holocaust, everything happens in Germany from 33 to 39 when the Second World War starts, and then Jews getting killed. But you don't know who these Jews are. Why? Because they're Polish Jews and Soviet Jews and Hungarian Jews. They're people who are not from Germany. They're not real. So I would propose that the ethical move of trying to put the Jews in the story by asking to what state they did belong and what happened to that state might help us to answer our historical question of how the Holocaust could have happened. Okay, so let's think for a minute about the European state system. The European state system, as established after 1918, as established after the First World War, is a matter of alliances between sovereign nation states. When Germany comes to power in 1933, there is a first failure of this system. Despite the fairly explicit nature of Hitler's international goals, no one makes an alliance against him. In a little-known moment of European diplomatic history, the Poles actually propose a common invasion with the French, which doesn't happen. More familiar failures are the reoccupation of the Rhineland. That's a territory which the French had occupied after the war, which the Germans just take. Munich, when the great powers agreed to dismantle Czechoslovakia and give Czechoslovak territory to Hitler, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union sign, in effect, a military alliance and begin the Second World War together. What I'd like to claim is that this little story that I've told you about the collapse of the European state system is also the history of the Holocaust. That the collapse of the states in response to first German pressure and then German aggression has a great deal to do, has almost everything to do with how the Holocaust unfolds. So why might I think this is the case? Well, between 1933 and 1938, there are basically two policies pursued against the Jews inside Germany. Remember, between 33 and 38, Hitler only controls Germany. These policies are expropriation, that is the attempt to take Jewish property, and immigration, that is humiliation so that Jews will actually go away. These policies have very limited success. Not very much property is actually taken away, and less than half of the German population of Jews leaves. Then something very decisive happens in 1938. In 1938, Hitler destroys two states, in effect, Austria and Czechoslovakia. And a very important lesson is learned here. And it's going to seem incredibly obvious once I say it to you, and you're all going to nod sagely. If you destroy a state, one of the things that happens is that the civil code goes away. If you destroy a state, one of the things that happens is that people who had been citizens and had rights by way of being citizens, like, for example, property rights, which are fundamental in all of this, those rights go away. So if I can make, for example, Ohio cease to exist, or if I can make the federal government of the United States cease to exist, you are all in a very different place than you were. I can't actually do that by doing this with my hand, but so you'll be relieved to learn. But if I could do it with my hand, you would be suddenly in a very, very different place. Your cars, your houses, all the things that belong to you would be there for the taking for everyone else. You would have no legal protection. The police would no longer be guarding you when you left this building. Instead, it's very likely that they would be assigned to hunt you down, and they would, because the police follow orders, which is one of the things we learned from the Holocaust. So this very elementary step of removing the state, just whisking it away, changes things fundamentally. So in Austria and Czechoslovakia, the same policies that Germany had been trying to implement versus German Jews, expropriation and immigration, suddenly take off. The Jews who know that the state is about to disappear sell their property at giveaway prices. When the state is gone, the property can just be taken. People leave because their situation is hopeless. So the lesson is learned here, I think, and a lesson is learned by, I don't just mean Germans in general, or Hitler even alone, but by a particular institution, whose name you've probably heard, the SS. Let me mention a name that you might have heard, Adolf Eichmann. It's Adolf Eichmann who was sent to Vienna and who organizes the expropriation and the immigration of Jews. And from the point of view of his institution, which is the SS, this is the beginning of a much larger process. From my point of view, the most important thing about the SS, this extraordinary paramilitary organization, is that their mission was to destroy states. It's an extraordinary thing if you think about it. They don't belong to the German state. They're a party organization. They belong to the Nazi Party. And what they are meant to do is to destroy other political entities out in the world. In Austria and Czechoslovakia, they play a very limited part. But the next year in Poland, they play an extraordinarily significant part. And this is where we move a big step forward closer to the Holocaust. Why is that? Well, in Poland, the destruction of the state is far more violent and decisive even than in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Poland is the first state to resist German aggression, which means for the first time, Hitler has this pretext to actually invade. You can do a lot of things under the cover of war that you can't without war. And since Poland is to be destroyed as a matter of policy, as a matter of deliberate policy, which Hitler makes absolutely clear, that the destruction of the Polish nation is the war aim, Hitler makes absolutely clear. The SS, these state destroyers, have a very clear mission. Their mission is to follow the army into Poland, to find the educated Poles, and to kill them. The reasoning being is that if you decapitate an entire society, then you have a mass of people you can colonize and exploit, enslave, in fact, and you have a situation where the nation can never rise again. So that is the policy goal. The second thing that happens in the invasion of Poland is that Jews are removed dramatically from their homes, from their property. It's made very clear that they don't have the right to property and that they themselves have become a kind of property. They're gathered up from towns in the countryside and they're forced into ghettos in the cities. Now, what is the idea for the Jews? What is the plan for the Jews at this point? I'm going to say something which is going to strike you as very strange, and then we're going to think together about why it's not strange at all. What was the German idea for the Jews as of 1939, 1940? The idea was that they were going to gather up the Jews of Europe and send them to Madagascar. Right? Madagascar. So for you, Madagascar probably means like a film that your parents saw, your kids saw. I'm not sure what generation I'm talking to. Maybe yours, but the association we have of Madagascar is not, right, of a horrible plan for destruction. But if we think for just a minute about the way the world was organized in the 1920s and the 1930s, this will start to make more sense. One broad way to think about what happens in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s is that European empires have run out of territory. The whole colonial project, which is the great story of European history, I mean, you can call it the age of exploration if you want, there are lots of nice names for it, but the age of imperial conquest and control and settlement, which begins in the 15th century, is running out of steam because European powers are running out of globe. They've run out of territory at this point, which means that the territory that's left is basically in Europe. So if you want to think about Hitler's colonial project, and the Stalinist one for that matter, this is a way to make it make more sense. If you wanted to get rid of something, so if Hitler is looking for this black hole in which to put the Jews, there are just little spots of territory here around the world which might possibly be useful. Guyana was considered, Uganda was considered, Palestine was considered, and Madagascar was considered. And not just by Hitler, is my point. Europeans across the continent, including Jews who wanted to leave the continent in the 1920s and 1930s, were all thinking of mass settlement to some neglected corner of the world where a new settlement, perhaps a final European settlement, would be possible. So as of 1938, 39, 1940, what the Germans are thinking is, once we get into Poland, we have to deal with millions of Jews, we're going to send them to Madagascar. Why doesn't this work out? Well, Madagascar, as you know, is an island in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. It was a French colonial possession, so when the Germans defeat France in 1940, they think this is going to fall into our lap. But what Hitler also thinks is that when he defeats France in 1940, the British will go out of the war. And here's another famous story, which I can only tell you very briefly. Churchill, speeches, blood, sweat, tears, these things. Does that capsule trigger anything in your mind? Good, because I actually can't tell the story of British resistance. It's one of the most extraordinary things, though, because Hitler, and not only Hitler, perhaps most of the British population, most Europeans, and probably most Americans, thought that after Hitler destroyed France, Britain would not stay in the war. Because how could Britain possibly win this war? Britain basically doesn't have an army. It doesn't have an army. How is it going to win a war against Germany, which has conquered the continent with probably the best army in the history of the world, the Wehrmacht? How is that going to happen? And Britain has no allies. Every country that signs up to a British ally immediately gets destroyed. So how is Britain going to be in this war? And one of the two British political parties was also of this opinion. So that Britain stays in the war is of world historical significance. I'm just mentioning this because if Britain doesn't stay in the war, how do the Americans come into the war? right? And how does the war turn? Okay, so you see that. But for our purposes, what you need to think of, and I'm sure you've already realized this, is that you can't settle people in Madagascar so long as the British fleet controls the sea lanes. So long as the British stay in the war, one of the many Hitlerian projects that they prevent is the settlement of Jews in Madagascar. But for Hitler, this is just a momentary stopping point, because the fundamental goal of Hitler's policy, as you'll remember, is the destruction of the Soviet Union and the conquest of living space in the East. So when the British stay in the war, despite the Blitz, despite the Battle of Britain, when the British stay in the war, what Hitler says is, okay, now we just have to invade the Soviet Union. Because if we invade the Soviet Union, he tells his generals, that will scare the British out of the war, and he's thinking to himself, that will fulfill my project. That's the end. That's what I've been after the entire time. And this is absolutely crucial for the Holocaust in ways that are a little bit subtle, but I hope you can pay just a little bit of attention to how things get complicated, because it's in the complication that we begin to see what's new. When Hitler orders his armies against the Soviet Union in June of 1941, he also orders the state destroyers against the Soviet Union. As in Poland, the army is followed by the SS. And as in Poland, the SS is ordered to destroy the state by physically eliminating the political class, right? In Poland, that was people like you and me, people with college educations. In the Soviet Union, the definition of the political class was different. It was members of the Communist Party, Jews, right? So the moment that the German army crosses into the Soviet Union, the SS follows and begins to kill Jews in the name of destroying the state. Now, as they do this, okay, here's where it gets tricky. And here's where, the fact that I didn't hand out any maps is really gonna come back to bite me. So just think with me for just a second. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, what actually happened? In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland. Germany came from the west, the Soviets came from the east. The Soviets also occupied and annexed the Baltic states. Okay, so when Germany invades the Soviet Union, what is it actually doing? The very first thing it's doing is that it is invading states, places that the Soviets have just invaded, right? So these territories, Eastern Poland, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, have just been invaded by the Soviet Union. And incidentally, or not so incidentally, their political classes have also been targeted and destroyed. By the way, the Soviets are much better at this than the Germans. The Soviets have had a great deal of practice in the 1920s and 1930s. So if you think of the Estonian government, for example, of the 12 ministers of government, 10 of them are killed. One of them runs away. That's much, much better than the Germans managed to do, if better is the word for it. So these places have already suffered state destruction, and then the Germans come in and they destroy the state again. Now this is a kind of political calamity which it's very difficult for us to imagine. A state is destroyed and then it's destroyed again 2 years after that, and it's destroyed by the two most desperately ambitious totalitarian powers in the history of the world, right? It's a level of intense suffering and also of humiliation, which is very difficult for us to imagine. Now, why do I say humiliation? If your state is destroyed, right, just imagine, try to imagine just for 3/4 of a second that someone has destroyed the United States of America. How do you feel about that? And not in a nice Paul Ryan sort of way where we all stop paying taxes and 100 years from now there's nothing left, but in an aggressive military way, right? Imagine that someone has destroyed the United States of America. How do we feel about that? Right? It'd be nice to think that we feel angry and we would do something about it. And maybe we would if the circumstances changed so that we could. But one thing that we would certainly feel is humiliation, right? And the Germans, when they come into these territories, they're aware that this humiliation is a kind of political resource, and they use it as such, okay? So think with me now and remember, what does Hitler say about the Soviet Union? What is his view of the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union is a Jewish state. So if the Soviet Union had just conquered Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Eastern Poland, whose fault was that? The Jews. And this is what the Germans come in and say. And it's very effective as propaganda. This idea that the Jews are communists and the communists are Jews, the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, in Germany is a kind of abstraction because there aren't that many Jews. And most communists are obviously not Jews. But suddenly, when you run into Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Eastern Poland, places which have just been humiliated, their polities destroyed by Soviet power, this myth all of a sudden takes on force. Why does it take on force? Does it take on force because it's true? No. It takes on force because it's false. If it was the Jews' fault, then it's not my fault, then it's not your fault. If it's the Jews' fault, then all of us who collaborated, all of us who collaborated with the Soviet system by teaching in schools or by going to schools or by staying in the army or by working for the police, all of us who in fact collaborated, who continued our normal life under Soviet rule, now have an excuse. We now have a scapegoat, and we now have a way of saying it wasn't us. So when the Germans come in and say it was the Jews, they get a fair amount of support for this view. And they're able to rally a couple of thousand people for pogroms and a couple of thousand more to serve in police units. Why is this so important? This is so important that now we have actually reached the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the deliberate mass murder of the entire Jewish population. It begins in the summer and fall of 1941 in the occupied Soviet Union. And it begins with a technique, a very effective technique, of a small number of Germans, what I'm calling the SS, a small number of Germans organizing much larger numbers of local militias in massive and organized and increasingly efficient shooting campaigns. By the end of 1941, something like 1 million Jews have been shot. And the shooting of Jews will continue throughout the war, such that half of the Holocaust will take place by shooting. And the important thing for our point here is that this is the Holocaust. The Holocaust has now begun. There are things which are more familiar, I know, the gas chambers at Belzec or Sobibor, Treblinka or Auschwitz. Those things come later, and those things are a change of technique. What has been shown at this point is that the black hole into which the European Jews can be put is not some imaginary thing, nor is it a faraway island off the coast of Africa. The black hole into which the Jews can be put is right in the middle of Europe. It's right in this zone of double statelessness. That is where the Jews can be eliminated. And the way they can be eliminated, the technique by which they can be eliminated is killing. And the morally awful thing about the Nazis, by the way, is not that they had a master plan from the beginning to kill all of the Jews. There was no such master plan. Hitler didn't know how it was going to happen, this elimination. The morally horrible thing about the Nazis was that killing the Jews was exactly the same as making them immigrate. There was no difference as far as they were concerned. If killing was a technique that worked, then we'll kill them. It's a matter of total indifference. And think on that. Think on what that means. Okay, so there are further explanations as to why statelessness brings on the Holocaust, but I'll save that for questions if you're interested. The point that I want to make here is that by destroying states, Hitler has found a way to realize his vision. He's found a way to realize the vision. He's in effect created this kind of state of nature that he was talking about before. He's created this war of races. He's taken a Europe which was defined by state power, and he's turned it into something which really does look a bit like a war of races. The important difference is, though, that the X factor in this world is not, of course, the Jews, who are powerless and being killed. The X factor in this world are precisely the Germans. The Germans are making this world. It's obviously not just a nature which is restored, it's a world that's being made. Okay, now, in the third part of this talk, I want to look at this from the other end. You might be asking yourselves, well, what about all the good people? Where were the good people? Where were the rescuers? How were Jews saved? And of course, that's in American Holocaust films are always about Jews being saved. And that's because of who we are and what Hollywood is. But in general, Jews were not saved. It's the exception. And when we think about how Jews were saved, we can see just how important the state and statelessness was. Consider two examples, Estonia and Denmark. Two Scandinavian countries, small populations of Jews, weak traditions of anti-Semitism, probably a little bit stronger in Denmark than in Estonia. In Denmark, almost all of the Jews live, almost all of them. In Estonia, almost all of the Jews die. It's actually about 99% on each side, so it's about as dramatic a difference as you can imagine. The difference is what? It's not anti-Semitism, it's not pre-war history, it's the nature of the German occupation regime. Denmark is the lightest occupation regime. The state is allowed to function. The worst thing that happens basically is that the queen has to go abroad. No, that doesn't even happen, that's the Netherlands. And in Estonia, the state is totally destroyed, first by the Soviets, then by the Germans. And the Estonians do a very, very efficient job then of killing the Jews when the Germans arrive. So the degree of state structure, this is the point that I'm trying to make. I'm now stepping back and making a general point, an observation about numbers we know. The degree of survival, your chances for survival seem to depend, or at least are very strongly correlated with, the degree of the state that remains. So if you are in a state, let's say it's Nazi Germany, right? Let's say you're a Jew in Nazi Germany. Or let's say you're in a German ally, like Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, France. You would think then that your chances of survival would be close to nil, but they're not. They're about 1 in 2. If you're in a place where the state is destroyed completely, Poland, the Western Soviet Union, the Baltic states, and you're a Jew, your chances of surviving are about 1 in 20. So Hitler's intention is everywhere the same, the elimination of Jews wherever German power can reach. But his ability to realize that intention seems to be very powerfully limited by the existence of institutions. So we've seen how statelessness can bring about killing. How does the existence of the state prevent it? Let me just give you a couple of examples. If you think of the rescuers, the actual rescuers, the people who saved a lot of Jews, how did they do it? They did it by giving them passports or visas or other documents that could restore some kind of state recognition to the Jews. There was a Japanese consul in Kaunas in Lithuania who saved a couple of thousand Jews. Why did he do this? He did it because he was a spy and he was running them as spies across Siberia, but that need not detain us. He was able to do it because he had the power of giving Jews papers, of giving them state recognition. The Chinese consul in Vienna saved several hundred Jews. How could he do that? Because he could give them visas which would allow them to travel in China. The most famous case is the Swedish ambassador in Hungary, who also saved a very large number of Jews. Same method. So it's the state, you see, that's doing a lot of this. And it's this, even where organizations are sort of half-state organizations, then you find the rescue again. So there are quasi-state organizations at work here, like the Soviet partisan armies or the Polish partisan armies. In both cases, because they both kill Jews and they save Jews. When they're functioning like the legal representations of the state, they tend to save Jews. When they're functioning like partisan armies generally behave, they kill Jews. They're somewhere in between. Now, think for a second, and this is the important case, about Hungary or Romania or Italy. Are these nice places to be if you're a Jew or in general in the 1930s and 40s? No, not especially. But they are states. So when Hitler asks his allies in 1942 to send their Jews to the death camps, what do the allies say? They say yes or they say no? They say no. Why do they say no? Because they love their Jews so much? No, because their Jews are citizens of their states. And so whatever they're going to do to their Jews, and sometimes it's very bad indeed, they're going to do it in their own name as a sovereign state. So states have citizenship. What else do states have? They have foreign policy. So if there's no state, there's no foreign policy. There's no Poland, there can't be a Polish foreign policy. But there can be a Hungarian or a Romanian or Italian or a French foreign policy. Why does this matter? Because somewhere around early 1943, it becomes clear that the Germans are probably going to lose the war. If the Germans are going to lose the war and the Americans and British are going to win, maybe it wouldn't be such a good idea to kill your Jews, right? I mean, is that an ethical calculation? No. It's a hardcore realpolitik calculation. But you can't have realpolitik unless you have a state. So foreign policy considerations save hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews. So that's the other reason, and really the main reason, I think, why the state is so important. Now, let me just close with a couple of thoughts about the future. Let's just assume, I'm sure you'll have questions, and I'm sure you'll have arguments, and maybe there'll be convincing arguments. But let's just assume for the moment that the explanation that I've given for the Holocaust of the European Jews is right. What would that mean for the future as we look ahead? What would that mean for the 21st century? So there's one model that we would have to displace from our minds, and that would be the totalitarian model. The idea that what happened in the Holocaust, or what happens in events of this kind, is that a state became very strong, it controlled every aspect of the lives of its citizens, and that included killing them. That never happened in Germany. That event never happened in Germany. It is, by the way, a much better description of the Soviet Union, but that never happened in Germany. The German dictatorship was never that powerful. It never controlled the lives of all of its citizens. It oppressed certain rather small groups very well, but it was not a massively oppressive state in general. When it killed people, it was almost entirely beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, beyond the borders of Germany. It was almost entirely in places where they first destroyed the state. There they killed people who lived there, and there they killed their own. So the Jews of Germany were also not killed in Germany. They were sent to Minsk, or they were sent to Riga, or they were sent to Auschwitz, or they were sent to Theresienstadt, and they died there. So the killing does not, you can't imagine that the Holocaust happened because of something inside a state. You have to think globally to understand Hitler, and you have to think in terms of the state and its destruction to see how this sort of thing could possibly happen. Now, the other thing that we have to then learn and think through and consider is Hitler's attitude about science and technology. Right? So it's a banality, it's very simple to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. Hitler was wrong about science. I mean, this is sort of the tragedy of one of the many tragedies of the 1930s. In the 1930s, both the Germans and the Soviets, in different ways, think that science can't solve food problems. And as a result, both of them kill millions of people. This is a story I tell in my book, Bloodlands. But by about 1960, the problem is completely the reverse. By 1960 in Europe, the soil is too fertile, because of little things that usually escape histories of genocide, but which can't escape them any longer, like irrigation, like pesticides, and above all, hybrids. These little things, this green revolution, meant that all of a sudden Europe was producing more food than it needed. And Hitler's entire worldview, right, then becomes preposterous in another way. It becomes the one way in which it seemed like it maybe made sense that there was too little land, too little food. All of a sudden, that's not a problem. And so this is the part of the talk which gets truly depressing, right? You've all had a smile on your face up to now, right? What if this green revolution, which we take for granted, is at its end? Okay? So the main reason why we have trouble understanding Hitler, and for that matter Stalin too, is that we have trouble understanding that the limits of food could be a real political problem, right? Our political problem is that, I mean, what's Michelle Obama doing for us now, right? Our political problem is that we have too many calories. The Germans and the Soviets and everybody else in the 30s also counted calories, but they counted them because they didn't have enough. State planners literally counted calories on the scale of the entire state because there weren't enough of them to keep the oxen and the donkeys and the horses and the male human beings moving in the fields like they had to be moved, right? Now, that world is completely lost to us. Pretty much everyone, who's under the age of about 85 cannot really conceive, okay, maybe 75, cannot really conceive of that world because we grew up in a world where that no longer made any sense. So in other words, we have forgotten something which is absolutely crucial about National Socialism, and we have forgotten it right at the point when it might be returning to us. And of course, by this I mean global warming. One of the things which happens with global warming is that the fertility of soil starts to become unpredictable. Places which have been fertile are going to cease to be fertile in ways that we cannot anticipate. Because we cannot anticipate it, we may overreact, we may make sudden moves, we may do things we hadn't done before, and we may think that it makes complete sense. Just as a little note to this, whether or not you think global warming is happening really doesn't matter, because the people who control the armies and the people who buy commodities know that it's happening. So we can spend as long as we want putting our hands in the sand, but that is while we are doing that, the Chinese are buying up Africa. And they're trying to buy up Ukraine on the exact same logic that Hitler tried to conquer Ukraine. The only reason they haven't bought up Ukraine, by the way, is that it's really hard to do a deal in Ukraine. It's a desperately hard place to do a deal. But the point is a serious one. The world, as we look out into the 21st century, may start to look, if not to you, to many people, to important people, much like the world looked in the 1920s, which creates a vacuum into which ideologies, not one which is just like Hitler's, of course, but similar ideologies which justify conquest and extermination might rush in. The final thing that I want to think about here is how one might characterize what was going on in Hitler's mind in a way that it might not seem completely alien to what might be happening to us. I think that the one thing that we share with Hitler is that we are in something that you might think of as an ecological panic. Hitler looks at the world and he thinks, there is no way that science can solve this problem. We have to do something else. Year after year, we are edging closer to the moment where we draw the same conclusion, where, for whatever reason, bad faith, laziness, failure of international cooperation, we're edging ever closer to the point where we're going to say global warming is irreversible, There's not going to be time for science and technological solutions. The only thing that we can do is act politically and militarily. In other words, Hitler was writing in an ecological panic, by which he was writing in a moment where it seemed plausible to say science isn't going to solve what is really a problem. That ecological panic ended around 1960. It's possible that our ecological panic will also end in around 2060, but it's only going to end if we're able to take seriously the lessons of the past and start to believe ourselves, among other things, in science and not just in technology. And that's where I'll leave you. Thanks.
I got so excited I had to take my coat off, and I'm certain there are going to be lots of questions, and Dr. Snyder has agreed, I think, to answer the questions. So please. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Could you do me a favor, sir? Could you just tell me your name and it's a little quirk of mine. Thank you.
I found it a fascinating new way of looking at the Holocaust.
Thank you.
Ways which I have not seen before. There's one little bit of dissonance in there, and that's one thing. It seems that when Hitler called together the representatives in Eastern Europe that he had subjugated, he expected a great deal of resistance for them to send their troops, and there wasn't any. They were quite ready. That doesn't seem to fit into that scheme, unless I've misunderstood something.
Okay. So thank you very much for that question. The gentleman is referring to a conference of second-level members of German ministries in January of 1942 at Wannsee, which is in Berlin. What these second secretaries were doing was they were coordinating the total policy of the German state vis-a-vis the Jewish question. That's what they were up to. And from Wannsee, we have a sense of how many Jews the Germans thought there were, and we also have a sense of what the Germans thought they were doing with them. But it's tricky. It's a tricky document to interpret because, like most German documents having to do with the Holocaust, there's an awful lot of euphemism. But as of Wannsee, the idea seems to have been we're going to kill quite a few in the East, and we're going to make a lot of them more of them work for us. In fact, the Holocaust turned out to be much more killing than Wannsee predicted and much less exploitation. Now, the part which I'm not sure I understood about your question is the willingness of the Allies. Because you're right that the Germans assume that their allies are just going to send their Jews. And there is an important case where it's already happened, which is Slovakia, which does, well, it hasn't already happened, it's going to happen. They're right about one case, which is Slovakia. Slovakia is going to initially send its Jews. But in fact, in general, the Germans are wrong. In general, the Allies don't send their Jews. Italy doesn't send its Jews until Germany conquers Italy, after Italy switches sides. Hungary doesn't send its Jews, again, until Germany conquers it, destroys the Hungarian authorities, and brings in its own authorities. So the Allies confirm the rule. So long as they are sovereign states, they generally don't send their Jews. They do terrible things to their Jews, right? Some of them. Hungary kills, in a distinct policy, about 250,000 Jews. Hungary sends 40 million Jewish laborers behind its army into the Soviet Union, where they die. These are dreadful things. But they're not the Holocaust. They're not in the sense that they're not participation in the German policy. When Germany actually asks its allies to send Jews, in general they don't. And if they start, then they change their minds. Like Vichy France, for example. Vichy France starts to, it edges towards it, it sends its foreign Jews, which has the interesting side effect that the largest number of Jews killed in the French Holocaust were Polish Jews, because Vichy wanted to get rid of its foreigners and Germany wanted to destroy Jews, and that's where the policies overlapped. But they change, they stop, and it has to do with these ideas of sovereignty. Vichy wants to be able to negotiate with the British and the Americans afterwards, and that's the interesting part of the story. So it's as though I don't think the Germans quite understood how important state destruction was. Because they weren't thinking the way I'm thinking. I'm trying to explain how it could happen, as opposed to what the Germans were planning. It actually turns out that where there were states, even allied states, the Holocaust didn't happen in the same way as elsewhere. Yes, please.
My name is Natalie. I'm a student at Oberlin. I was curious. You said that Germany didn't have a strong dictator state, but it seems like, and of course I was taught like back in junior, sophomore year of high school, that they were strong military-realistic kind of thing, so didn't it affect most of the families, if not all, because they had to send their sons and such to the war, and there was like a really strong military power there.
Okay, thank you for that question, because it allows me to clarify that remark, which was probably unclear. The German state was repressive in a number of ways. So before the war, and one of my points here has been that the war changes everything, because then the Germans send their army and the SS abroad, where they really do the damage. But before the war, the German state is oppressive in very significant ways. It has a system of concentration camps, which are mainly for punishment. It has stigmatization and exclusionary policies, not only of Jews, which I mentioned, but also of gypsies and homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses, not because they were Jehovah's Witnesses, but because Jehovah's Witnesses very often refuse to do the things you're expected to do in Germany, like the so-called German greeting, which I'm not going to reproduce, but you know what I'm talking about. They wouldn't do things like that. They also wouldn't bear arms. So there were groups who were stigmatized. They included also social groups, like people who were thought to be work shy, the homeless. They were stigmatized. They were often put in camps as well. So that was repressive. Germany was repressive in the sense that it was no longer a functioning democracy. After Hitler wins power, the leaders of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party are put in concentration camps. It's very hard for a mass party to function in those circumstances. People flee, they go into hiding, the politics stops working. So the parliament continues to meet and it continues to, it votes unanimously whatever Hitler wants, but there's no democracy. It's repressive in that sense. It's also repressive in the sense that the way that schools teach and the way that public discourse is organized moves towards a certain model, organized chiefly by a propaganda minister called Joseph Goebbels. So it is a very repressive state from our point of view, and I don't mean to minimize that. And of course you're right that the service of a huge percentage of German males in the Wehrmacht involved participation and at least witnessing terrible acts of repression. The distinction I'm trying to make is between a place like Germany, where the truly horrible things seem to have been a combination of what I'm calling this planetary ideology and then the destruction of political order on a neighboring part of the planet, not your own exactly. I mean, the interesting thing, I'm still trying to think of how to talk about this, but what the German state does is that it corrupts its own statehood and then it exports these state destroyers and state corruptors onto territory, where they destroy existing institutions, some of them, like the civil code, like the rule of law, and exploit other ones, like the police forces. So if you destroy the state of Ohio, but you keep the highway patrol, they will actually do terrible, you may think they do terrible things, but they don't. I mean, if you destroy the state and you keep the police, they will continue to follow orders. So, which is really interesting. So in 1938, in Poland, this is something we know something about, the police would stop pogroms. Why? Because what is a pogrom? A pogrom, an attack on Jews, is also an attack on Jewish property. Nobody likes attacks on property, right, in a capitalist state. So the police would stop the pogroms, and the people who started them would get prosecuted. Often the sentences would be too light, but they were violating laws, they get prosecuted. 4 years later, those very same men, literally those same men, will be hunting down Jews, because the Polish state and its law code has been removed, and they're now serving the German police. Anyway, my point is that what all I'm trying to explain here is the Holocaust, this one event. And it seems to me the Holocaust involves state destruction plus this ecological worldview. There are other models of destruction, like the Soviet Union, which is internally, in fact, much more repressive than Nazi Germany is. It has a much bigger police force, huge concentration camps. So in 1939, there were something like 20,000 Germans in concentration camps, which is a lot, of course. In the Soviet Union, there's well over 1 million. We're looking at a completely different scale. By 1939, the Germans have killed about 200 of their own citizens. Bad. The Soviets in 1937 and 1938 killed about 700,000 of their own citizens. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make the case that Germany and the Soviet Union they're not the same. Right? It's not just, you can get to, or to answer your question a different way, you can get to a policy of killing a whole group, not by progressively becoming more repressive inside your borders, but by destroying everybody else's borders and doing things on their land. So it is a repressive state, but the truly horrible things happen when it exports elements of itself into this territory. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yes, please.
Yeah, I like your theory. It's very interesting. It seems to make sense in the context of, let's say, what happens in Cambodia in 1970. Does it also explain what happens in Rwanda and other cases of genocide? Have you sort of expanded or applied your ideas to these other cases of genocide or mass killing?
Well, So what I'm trying to do in this little exercise is to really explain the Holocaust, because those of us who think about human rights and genocide, we kind of assume we understand the Holocaust, and then in some ways we look at other events as being versions of it, or like it's the Holocaust with an asterisk, they didn't kill everybody. You know, we see it as a kind of paradigm, and then but what if we don't actually understand the Holocaust? So my mission here is a little bit more modest. It's not modest, but it's more modest than what you're asking of me. I'm just really trying to understand the Holocaust. That said, there are certain things here which, once you notice them, then start to pop up in other cases. So Rwanda, right? In Rwanda, the Hutu are killing the Tutsi, right? Except when they're not, because there are whole parts of the country where there aren't Tutsi. And what happens during those couple months in those parts? Hutu kill other Hutu. And who are they killing? Well, it's generally the poor killing the rich, and the people with worse access to water killing people with better access to water, and the people who have less land killing the people with more land, right? So there's a suggestion here, and I'm not claiming to be an expert on Rwanda, of a kind of ecological scenario which is behind this. So it may be that when you have the ecological problem, you get some kind of mass killing, and when you have the statelessness problem, you get another kind of mass killing, and that the two of them together, appropriately brought together by ideology, is the fatal combination that we're looking for. We're trying to avoid, rather. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful speech. My name is Kondwani, and I had two questions for you.
Please.
Well, the first one is, I couldn't comprehend, I've never taken a history class, maybe I couldn't comprehend when you say after the Soviet Union invaded Estonia, and then the Hitler came in.
Yeah.
I couldn't get how we managed to convince them to be on his side, even though he colonized them as well. They should turn against him. And then my second part of the question is a bit broad, but you mentioned something about China going into Africa, right, and buying up Africa. Well, I don't know, but from history, I've through experience as well, because I'm from Zambia, so.
Yeah.
When I last checked in the history books, from what my grandparents told me, that when the British went there, there were things that were done, and there was colonization that happened, and Africa was plundered, and the resources, and under colonialism. Well, they left due to the British. Some of the British had left us peace, and then I think it still happens in a different way today, even considering like the Americans. I don't mean this in a bad way, but I know that there's some well-wishers in America and other places in England as well that have really helped Africa get back on its feet after some sectors of people did some bad things. But also, I think that the developments that they left, when they were there, they don't justify Zambia going back to them, ask for help. And also like the IMF and the World Bank and other NGOs, I think they also play a different role, in trying to control of Africa, through sanctions and things like that. Like if you look at the cases in Zimbabwe. So I think China is doing a good thing right now, because I see development of roads and this and buildings and schools and hospitals. And I know that there's also this threat. Like sometimes I see a lot of Chinese in my country, and I'm like, oh, maybe we're changing, but I think there's a group of undeniable reality that lives are being changed for the better somehow. And it's the need that is there, and those people that need to be worked on. It's not like if somebody's hungry one day, they will need the food then. It's not a matter about how I live tomorrow. It's a matter of just I have to use by all means possible. I think Chinese are doing a great way, because I don't think anybody can be perfect in that way. Or basically like that. Like, is there any suggestions of how good I could be?
Okay, I think I get it. Okay, let me remind everyone of the first question. The first question was, why did, for example, Estonia, you could also ask about Lithuania, Latvia, given that the Germans were also going to colonize them, why would they side with the Germans? And the answer is that people react in these situations to what they've just experienced, not to what's about to happen. So when the Soviet Union conquers the Baltic states, one of the policies it carries out is the deportation of the elites of these places to the Gulag. And this happens to be going on in June of 1941, right before the Germans are invading. And when the Germans arrive, the Soviets are hastily executing the remaining prisoners they have in jail and in prison, which means that the Germans arrive, they pull these corpses out, they say, look what the horrible Jews did to you. In these situations where you've been destroyed by military power and then liberated, that's the idea, you always say you're liberating people, at least at the beginning, you always say liberate, and you're being liberated by someone else, you do side with the people who've just driven out the people who've caused you terrible suffering, if only for a moment. But the point I was trying to make, and thanks for the question, because maybe I didn't get it across, is that the Germans had a particularly fiendishly intelligent way of presenting themselves as liberation. They said, we are going to liberate you from the Jews. And if you want to take part in your own liberation, kill some Jews, right? So they all of this enormous humiliation or shame, or whatever it might have been, they channeled it pretty effectively towards the Jews. That's how it works. We're offering you liberation, but our understanding of what happened to you is you were oppressed by the Jews. So you want to take part in your liberation? Sign up for the police and help us with this problem. That didn't work on everybody, but it worked on enough people. We're talking about a total of in the Baltic states of around 20,000 people who actually took part in the killing of Jews, but that was enough. Now your second question is really interesting. It touches on a whole number of important themes that I've been thinking about, because in order to understand what's going on in Ukraine, one has to understand what has just happened in Africa, I think. I mean, I'm becoming more and more, when I say I'm trying to think about this globally, I really mean globally, because the people of the 20s and 30s, even if we see them as narrow-minded nationalists, which they were, or fascists, which they were, or whatever they might have been, they thought globally because theirs was an imperial world where a power center in Germany or France or Britain would have interests literally all around the globe. So they had no choice. They were less provincial than most of us are, at least in this way of seeing the whole globe. So when you think of Ukraine, how does Hitler think about Ukraine? He has two models of thinking about Ukraine. The first is Ukraine is like the American West. That is, the Slavs are like the Indians. And once we remove the Jews who have organized them, once we get rid of the Jews, the Slavs are just going to melt away. They're nothing. They're so inferior that we're just going to destroy them. What Hitler forgot, and this is sort of interesting given the way he was obsessed with bacteria and so on, what he forgot is that the way that the Americans actually, not the Americans, the settlers actually conquered Latin America, North America, had everything to do with bacteria. That's something which is totally absent from his thought. That's the way that European settler colonialism actually worked, is that the disease went first and it wiped out and demoralized, and then you came after. Africa comes last in European colonization precisely because there the disease barrier works the other way. It takes Europeans a long time to work their way into Africa, except in the very south. But they do, and the very last stage of imperial history is the so-called race for Africa in the 1880s and the 1890s. And the race for Africa is one of the things which brings about the First World War. And also, certain things happen in Africa which are strikingly like things that happened in Europe not so long afterwards. So, for example, the Germans were controlling southwestern Africa. They had their colonies in southwestern Africa, and they faced an uprising of the Herero and the Nama peoples. And what did they do? They decided that they were going to exterminate them as peoples. And how did they do this? Well, there's an island off the coast there, which is called Shark Island. And the plan was, the ones who have survived our military conquest, we're going to put them on that island and let them starve. Now, once you know that, I'm not saying that leads straight to the idea of putting Jews on Madagascar, but once you realize that Europeans have thought this way about displacing people and eliminating them, then what you realize is that what's happening in Ukraine is, it's being Americanized or it's being Africanized, at least in the minds of the Germans, right? So African history does play a kind of important role in all of this. But I realize I'm answering the question you didn't ask. I'm going to try to answer the question you asked about China. You're right. I mean, what the opinion polls show of Africans is basically exactly what you said. There was imperialism, it was exploitative, we're still reeling from it, we're suspicious. Now the Chinese have come, maybe they do some bad things, but they build bridges, they build roads, they clearly are employing people. The view you're giving, that's what Africans generally say. In public opinion polls, China comes off much better than the United States. in Africa. And that's because the Chinese are doing this very intelligently. They're not just sending what we do, they're not just sending in their corporations, and they're not doing what the European powers did. They're not just sending their armies and navies. They're sending in representatives of the state, they're making deals with people, they're building stuff. And so everyone sees that they're getting something out of the deal. And you're right, they are getting something out of the deal. That's true. The Chinese know about the colonial experience because they were colonized too, and they're trying to do something better. Now, certainly it's better in the short run. What concerns me is not that the Chinese have more evil intentions than anyone else. What concerns me is that when this land is de facto under Chinese control, that Africans are, when things get worse, right? So imagine global warming 20 years from now, much more desertification in Africa, less arable land, and the Chinese have bought up a lot of the best stuff. That's when I start to worry about the scenario. Yes, please.
Largely, but not totally a top-down explanation, because the destruction of states would be from the top down, but then you also have to respond. Where does the role, the bottom up of popular anti-Semitism and differences between regions and ethnic areas, depending on maybe religion and things like that, how does that fit into your model?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's actually the problem I'm trying to solve. Because it turns out that pre-war anti-Semitism doesn't predict wartime behavior very well at all. It's the easiest explanation, because you think, okay, the Holocaust is about anti-Semitism, these people were anti-Semitic. It doesn't really work. That was my Estonia-Denmark example. Countries are not very different. If you'd been asked in 1938, where is their history of anti-Semitism, you have to choose between Denmark and Estonia, you choose Denmark. And yet, the outcome is totally different. It's totally different. In Estonia, 99% killed. In Denmark, 99%. Now, is that because the Danes are that much? No, it's not. That doesn't have anything to do with it. What happens in Denmark is that the local German leadership, Werner Best, basically lets it be known to the Danes when he is supposed to carry out the final solution. Then the German army pulls back. The Navy stops patrolling the waters, and the Danes mount this admittedly courageous and wonderful rescue operation. But they couldn't have done it if the Germans didn't let them do it. That's the little secret of the Danish rescue. The Germans let them do it. And the reason Best let them do it was because he knew that he had to solve the Jewish question. He had orders. But he also knew that if he killed Danish citizens, he would be breaking up what was, up to that point, a very, very successful occupation regime in Denmark. Germany got 10% of its food from Denmark, which is a huge amount. The occupation of Denmark was working beautifully. He didn't want to disrupt that. So the solution he found was let the Danes, so to speak, solve the Jewish question by rescuing the Jews by sending them to Sweden. So then that happens, and what does Best report? He reports, I have solved the Jewish question in Denmark. And in some sense, he has. There aren't any more Jews there. Now that kind of thing is unthinkable in Estonia because of the worldview that I tried to make clear at the beginning, where Hitler does not see the West as the source of his colonies. The West is a kind of distraction. He never really even wanted to fight the war in the West. We think about France because we landed in Normandy. That was a sideshow from his point of view. The real action, he thought, was in the East. And in the East, you had to go in and just destroy political classes, clear people out. I mean, I didn't even touch on what the plans for the East really were, because this was a talk about Jews. But the idea was that you were going to starve 30 million East Europeans in the first winter of the war, 30 million, and then you were going to deport tens of millions afterwards. So you have this colonial project in the East that is very different from the West. The West is a kind of chain of collaborating satellites, basically. You get lots of food from Belgium, you get lots of food from the Netherlands, from France, from Denmark, and then you're trying to colonize the East. The irony is that they end up getting more food from Belgium than they do from Ukraine. But we're not thinking about irony, we're thinking about what Hitler actually wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was really subjugate, colonize, in a way Africanize. I mean, returning to the previous question, this whole part of Europe. So that, I think, helps us to understand the variation of outcomes. It's true that people who were more likely to be anti-Semitic were drawn in at the margin more by some of these things. So let me give you an example. In the summer of 1941, the first thing that the Germans do when they conquer territory which the Soviets had already conquered is they try to set off pogroms. So they try to repeat Kristallnacht on a kind of East European scale. Now, there are interesting things about these pogroms. The first is that most people don't take part. You have a lot of participation. There are about 200 pogroms, which is awful. About 20,000 people are killed, which is awful. But the vast majority of people do not actually take part in pogroms, which surprises the Germans. Why? Because the Germans think that among the bestial characteristics of the Slavs is that they're all primitive anti-Semites. And all you have to do is come in and sort of wave the flag and they'll just kill Jews. That's what they think. And they've got the film crews ready to document it. And they do their best to document it. But they are disappointed. If you read their records, it doesn't happen the way they expect it's going to happen. Which is why they make the move to recruiting relatively small numbers of local people as killing squads. And it turns out that that is a very effective technique. Now, why do I say that this is an example of how it matters on the margin? If you want to ask which villages had pogroms and which ones didn't, as a lot of my Polish colleagues are trying to figure out, it turns out that it does matter whether the priest was anti-Semitic in the 1930s, what relations between Poles and Jews were like in the 1930s. If you want to explain at that micro level why there's a pogrom here, why not there, yes, anti-Semitism matters. But in terms of broad participation, it's very actually hard to sort it out. So one of the things which really makes this tricky is that a lot of the people who collaborate in meaningful ways in the final solution in Eastern Europe had just been collaborating with the Soviet Union. Right? Which makes it very hard to think that it was their ideology which was at play. I mean, I think it makes it more likely that they were trying to purge themselves, that the fact that they'd already collaborated once meant they had, so to speak, to collaborate again. So local anti-Semitism certainly matters. And on a national scale, like when Polish historians are confronting this problem, as many of them are, I think they're exactly right to ask these questions of which regions were more anti-Semitic, which priests, and so on. I think that's right. But when we're trying to look at the question, the big question, there are other levels we have to be thinking at as well. So, I mean, I guess where I come down, one of the things I want to stress is that Hitler is not just like one anti-Semite among others. You know, in the 1930s, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States, in Germany, probably more in Eastern Europe. But Hitler was not just an anti-Semite among others. Hitler had a view about Jews which was extreme. There were a lot of anti-Semites even in power in Europe, but they were either of the conservative anti-Semitic kind, the live and let live, landowner kind, or they were of the fascist kind. You know, okay, so we have a view about Jews. Hitler was unusual in Europe in that he was the far right extreme, and that he was actually in power. That was an unusual situation, and I think we have to, before we get down to the level of who was anti-Semitic down here, we've got to make sure we really grasp the sort of horrible enormity of Hitler's view, which for me is it's so big and so destructive that, like, the word anti-Semitism, it's fine, it's accurate, but it doesn't seem to quite cover it for me.
Maybe we have time for one more question. I know a lot of you have to go study right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more thing I wanted to say. I'm giving like the world's longest answers, but one way that anti-Semitism works is actually in reverse. Okay, so if I steal, the Germans come in, they deport the Jews into a ghetto, and I then steal a Jew's house, I then become anti-Semitic, even if I wasn't before, because that helps me to explain why it is that I've done what's obviously a dishonorable thing. So this process of state destruction, this kind of targeted demoralization, it rolls in with anti-Semitism. I think it actually creates anti-Semitism or accelerates it. Sorry.
One more question? Well, maybe we can.
I think there's a shot. Thank you very much.